Hi, I'm Andy Lovelock. I'm a hobbyist woodworker living on the south coast of England, and I work predominantly with hand tools. About 18 months ago now, I decided that I wanted to learn to sharpen my own saws. So I bought a load of saws off of eBay, restored them, and set about teaching myself to sharpen them. At the time I read everything that was available on the internet, and it all helped. It was all good information, but I found I still had a lot of unanswered questions. So I thought it'd be a good idea to put together this video to hopefully help other woodworkers who might be considering learning the art of saw filing. Now, if you're used to working wood with hand tools, you'll know that mastering a new tool takes practice. But mastering a new tool is exactly what you're doing when you learn to sharpen saws. This tool, a tapered saw file. Master this tool and you'll master saw sharpening. But it does take a bit of practice because you've got to learn to control it and make it do what you want it to do. One thing I can promise you though, if you persevere, you will get it, and pretty soon you'll be wondering what all the fuss was about. So let me tell you what we're going to be covering in this video. I'm going to start by just talking about hand saws, show you some saws, go over some of the terminology that's used to describe the different parts of a saw, just so that we're all on the same page as to what we're talking about. And then I'll go over the terminology that's used in saw sharpening so you understand what I'm actually doing. Then we'll look at the tools you need to sharpen your own saws. And then we get on to the practical part, and I'm going to take a scenario-based approach to the demonstrations. Basically because what you have to do to any particular saw largely depends on two things: the state of the saw to start with and what you want to do to it. For instance, there's a world of difference between just touching up the teeth on a new high-end saw just to bring them back to sharp, and what you have to do to a saw that you might have picked up at a flea market or a car boot sale. You might want to change a saw from being a crosscut saw to a rip saw. You might want to change the number of teeth that are on a saw. And what you do in order to achieve all of these things is different. So I'm going to take a scenario-based approach. We're going to look at 4 saws, 2 hand saws and 2 back saws. Just before we start talking about saw terminology, let me just say that we're not talking about saws like this, that you're likely to find in your local DIY store today. These saws have induction hardened teeth and are made to be disposable. You cannot resharpen them. They cut great when they're sharp, but once they go dull, you just throw them away. We're also not talking about Japanese saws that cut on the pull stroke. All Western saws cut on the push stroke. Okay, so let's start by looking at this saw here. Here we have the saw plate. You can see it tapers down to the end opposite the handle, and this end is called the toe. The handle end is called the heel. I don't know whether you can see, but on this particular saw there's a slight protrusion there, which is called the nib. And there's a lot of speculation about what the nib was actually for. Some people say that it was for raking the sawdust out of really deep crosscuts in big timbers, such as are used in timber framing. Personally, I don't buy that one. I don't see how that little thing can rake the sawdust out any better than a line of sharp teeth. Other people say that it was used for holding a tooth guard on the saw by tying a piece of string around there. And whilst it might be useful for that for some people, I don't think that was its purpose either. No, it's purely there for decoration and just to improve the aesthetic qualities of the saw and balance up some of the detail that you find in the handle end. The plate didn't only taper along its length, but it tapered in its depth too. It is thinner at the back than it is at the tooth line. If I put this rather crude template over this saw, you can perhaps see how that happened. So here at the top of the toe end of the saw plate, this is its thinnest point, just here, and it gets thicker and thicker and thicker and thicker until the tooth line is the same thickness as the saw plate that goes into the handle. So all this area here is one constant thickness, and when you measure the thickness of a saw plate, you measure it just above the tooth line. But it got thinner and thinner and thinner towards the toe end and towards the back of the saw. And that's done for a number of reasons. It's called taper grinding, by the way, and all the best saws were taper ground. And it's done because it reduces the weight of the saw at the toe end. It also improves the balance of the saw because it puts the centre of gravity nearer the teeth. But one of the main reasons is because the saw is thinner along its back. As the saw progresses down into the cut, it won't bind in the cut because it's thinner at the back than it is at the teeth. If we look at this saw plate on this Diston D8, there's a couple of different features on this saw. You can probably see that the back of this saw is concave, and that's called a skew back. Some people call it a hollow back. One other difference on this saw is that the tooth line isn't straight, it's actually slightly convex along its length, and that's called crowning or breasting. Let's just talk about the fixings on old saws. This is called a medallion, and it invariably shows the brand logo of the saw, or the company's insignia, the company who made it. And if I turn the saw over, you can see how these are affixed. These are called split nuts, and you can probably see that the screw bisects the slot in the back of the nut. That's why they're called split nuts. And in order to undo these, you're going to need to fashion yourself a screwdriver that has a slot in it. Okay, and if you work with a lot of old saws, you're probably going to need 2 or 3 of these, because the split nuts in different manufacturers' saws had the slots were different widths, different lengths. So in order to get one that fits correctly, you're probably going to need 2 or 3 of these. But they're easily made. Just file out the centre of an old screwdriver. Many later saws had a different type of fixings, and here you can see that you can undo these with a normal screwdriver, just a flat bladed screwdriver. Here's an example of a split nut. You can see the screw in the end there, and the nut just screws onto the thread. Now these old split nuts on old saws were they're very fragile. You have to undo them very carefully. It's very soft brass. Typically the screw section would be brazed onto the head, and if you're not careful when you're undoing them, you can break them. So go very carefully if you try and take these old split nuts off. This is an example of the later type as found on Diston hand saws, and you can see how one half screws into the other half. A much better design of fixing, in my opinion. Although some saw makers today have gone back to the split nuts, purely because they're more traditional, but of course the brass that is used to make them today is a lot stronger, a lot better quality than it was back in the day. Let's just talk about some of the features of the handle. Here you have the cheek, here you have the V-groove, the recurve brake, the top horn, the bottom horn, and they have a function in that when I'm holding the saw, you can see how the bottom horn is helping me support the weight of the saw and control it. This rather lovely detail on the bottom of the handle here is called the lamb's tongue. You see how it kisses the underside of the cheek. This line across the back of the handle there is called the clip. And these little features here, this saw has them top and bottom, they're called the nib. And sometimes they come to a point, sometimes they're rounded in shape, and some saws have a double nib. This feature here is sometimes more of a hook shape, and it is called the hook. Okay, let's take a look at some back saws. So called because they have a rigid back which stops the saw plate from flexing when you're making a cut. And they came in a variety of sizes, from 8-inch, 9-inch, 10-inch, some 12 inches, some 14 inches. They went right up to 18 inches, and even bigger than that when you get into mitre saws. They went up to about 28 inches, 30 inches I believe some manufacturers offered. And in the old days you used to have an enormous amount of variety when selecting back saws. You could select a brass back or a steel back, you could have an extra heavy back, different lengths of saw plate, as I said, and they generally went up in 2-inch increments. The smaller ones went up in 1-inch increments, and you pick your back saw according to the cut that you need to make. So is it a cross cut, is it a rip cut, then you pick a saw that has the teeth filed accordingly. And also the depth of cut and the length of the plate can influence your choice of saw in any particular situation. And they're used for joinery work or for cutting wood to length at the workbench using a bench hook. Okay, so let's have a look at some of the terms that we use to describe the saw teeth and the angles that we file into the saw teeth. The intersection between the front of one tooth and the back of the next tooth at the bottom is referred to as the gullet. And the gullet takes its shape from the edge of the saw file that is used to file the teeth. At the top of the teeth, the intersection is called a point. And if we draw a line through all the points, we call that the point line. And it's important that all the points of the teeth are on the same line. They're all at the same height. If one tooth is slightly lower or a number of teeth are slightly lower, then they're not playing their part when you cut wood. Okay, they all need to be in a line in order to play their part and do their job. The angle on the front of the tooth, measured from perpendicular, is called the rake angle. So here we have some rip teeth, and rip teeth, generally speaking, range from 0 to 8 degrees rake angle. The angle between the teeth is 60 degrees, and that takes its shape from the saw file again. And saw files are triangular in cross section, and they're equilateral triangles, so we know from school that the three angles of a triangle always add up to 180 degrees, so 1/3 of that is 60 degrees. And since that's 60 degrees, then the inclusive angle of the tooth itself is also 60 degrees. If we draw a line, an imaginary line through the gullets, we call that the baseline. And the gullets of the teeth should all end up in a nice line as well, unless you're filing sloped gullets, and I'll talk more about that later. A tooth is measured from gullet to gullet, so that includes the front face and the back face of a tooth. So gullet to gullet is one tooth. And on cross-cut teeth, you can see that every alternate tooth I've shown here has a bevel angle on the front and the back of the tooth. These teeth, where you can't see the bevel angle, the bevel's on the other side of the tooth. And we refer to that as the phleem angle. The angle of the bevel is called the phleem angle. And the whole thing that we're talking about here we call tooth geometry. Tooth geometry. So you hear someone talk about tooth geometry, you know they're referring to the terms and the angles that the teeth are filed at. There are two methods to measure the number of teeth on a saw plate that we use historically and indeed are still used today. They are PPI, which stands for points per inch, and TPI, which stands for teeth per inch. When measuring points per inch, you start at a point of one of the teeth and you count the number of points that occur within a 1 inch measurement. So in this case it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. When you're measuring teeth per inch, you start at the gullet and you measure whole teeth. So here is one tooth. Okay, so that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 teeth in 1 inch. And a simple way to remember is that PPI minus 1 equals TPI. So there's always one less teeth per inch than there is points per inch. Okay? Okay, now you know how to measure the points per inch or the teeth per inch on your particular saw. Let's have a look at some tapered saw files. They come in a variety of lengths and a variety of sizes, and you need to ensure that you get the right size file for the particular saw that you're about to sharpen. Now I've listed out the saw files that 4 popular online woodworking sites sell, and there are other online woodworking sites that sell saw files. I'm not saying only buy from these 4, but we have Classic Hand Tools here in the UK, toolsforworkingwood.com in the US, Lee Valley in Canada, and workshopheaven.com in the UK. Now, Classic Hand Tools sell the Valorbe files, Tools for Working Wood and Lee Valley sell the Grobet Swiss files, and workshopheaven.com sells the Barco files. All of these files are good files. They'll give you good service. You do on occasion get a bad file where the edge will crumble after a few strokes, but you know, you've just got to deal with that. Phone them up, I'm sure they'll put it right and send you another one out straight away. Now, the reason I've taped these to the table here is from these 4 different companies is to show you that some sites will list their saw files in teeth per inch and some will list them in points per inch. So be careful when you go and buy your saw files that you've measured your saw in either PPI or TPI and you know exactly which file is the right file for your saw. And sometimes there is a choice, so you might look at workshopheaven.com who sell the Barco files, and if I've got a 12 teeth per inch saw, I could buy a 5-inch extra slim which goes up to 12 teeth per inch, or I could buy a 5-inch double extra slim which starts at 12 teeth per inch. Now where you've got a choice like that, I always buy the smaller of the 2 files, which is the 5-inch double extra slim, because that gives me a slightly deeper gullet to the teeth. You can also buy double-ended saw files. You can see that this one can actually be turned round in this handle, and you can use the other length. Now that might seem like a good idea, but the length of stroke is really short and it will take you twice as long to file your saw with one of these double-ended files. So I really wouldn't recommend these. You're better off with the full length ones, and it will give you a much longer stroke, and you know that's a lot better, a lot quicker when you're filing your saws. So take your time, make sure you've got the right file for your saw. One of the most important tools you're going to need, of course, is a saw vise. This is one that I've made just out of some scrap sapele and some 25mm MDF. You can buy saw vices new today from Gramercy Tools. They make a lovely saw vise, only 14 inches long I believe it is, so if you're filing hand saws you will have to move the saw in the vise at least once. And there are many designs available on the internet. If you search for saw vise you'll see many different designs available, so do your research and find one that works for you and your situation. My design criteria when I made this one was this: it should not be necessary to remove the handle in order to sharpen a saw. The saw vise should cater for all of my saws from an 8-inch dovetail saw up to a 28-inch rip saw. It should not be necessary to move the saw in the vise in order to sharpen all the teeth. It should not be necessary to remove the saw from the vise to sharpen from the other side. The vise should be substantial enough that it will absorb any vibration caused by filing. It should provide even clamping pressure along the length of the saw plate. It must work on my Black & Decker Workmate and on the workbench that I intend to build in the future, which will probably be a split top Roubo with a twin screw bench on a bench add-on, or a Moxon vise. If you don't know what a Moxon vise is, you can Google that as well. There'll be lots of pictures of Moxon vises that come up these days. And lastly, apart from the hardware, it must be made out of materials that I already have. I didn't want to spend a lot of money on it. So as I say, it's just made from some scrap hardwood and 25mm MDF. So basically there's a piano hinge at the bottom underneath here, and the whole thing acts like a big clamshell. The saw fits in there, I don't have to move it. When you make a clamp though, you want to make sure that the clamp meets at the top edge, so it's clamping the saw plate right by where you're going to file it. You'll notice that there are a number of holes on the back, and that allows me to move the carriage bolts that go through both sides and position them according to the saw that I'm filing. So you can see they're in a configuration now for filing this 26-inch handsaw. If I move them up, that'll be for a say a 14 or a 16-inch back saw or a smaller panel saw, right up to the top line, which is for my smaller back saws, such as my dovetail saws and 12-inch carcass saws. I cut some garden hose and put it on the thread in the middle of the clamp, so the bolts pass through the garden hose, and that's just to protect the backs of my saws, as I don't want them being scratched on the threads of the carriage bolts. And you can see I added a little file holder onto the end of it there. So that's basically all it is, really, just a big clamp. But it provides enough mass and holds the saw tightly. Some people prefer to put rubber or leather on the face of their jaws. I haven't found that necessary, to be honest, with this design, but it works for me, and you need to find one that works for you. If you want to copy what I've done, go ahead. You'll find a blog entry on my blog on lumberjocks.com. The blog's called Saw Talk, so if you go onto lumberjocks.com and you search for Brit, which is my username on lumberjocks.com, you'll find an episode in my Saw Talk blog that describes how to make this saw vise. Okay, so in addition to the saw files, let's have a look at some of the other tools that you're likely to need when you come to sharpen your own saws. We have some permanent markers, always a good idea. They're useful for marking the tops of the teeth, so that when you're filing you can see which teeth you filed and which ones still need to be filed, and some people use engineer's fluid for that as well. But you'll find that very useful, particularly on saws with the smaller teeth. You have a brush for just brushing away the metal filings from your saw vise, a micrometer or vernier calipers for measuring the thickness of the saw plate, and then we have saw sets. These are for bending the teeth alternately either side of the saw plate, and that gives you clearance in your cut as you're sawing. And these two are made by Eclipse. They're number 77s. The one with the red paint is a finer plunger, so that's for finer teeth, and the one without the red paint is for bigger teeth. And they're Eclipse number 77s, and available very commonly on eBay in the UK and Europe. If you're in the US, then what a lot of people use there is the Stanley 42X, so you might want to look out for those. These two are newer models fashioned after the Eclipse number 77. They're made by Somax, and many online woodworking sites have those available. The blue one is for the finer teeth, the gold one is for the bigger teeth. A magnifying glass I also find is very useful. Sometimes you want to get up close and personal to the teeth to make sure that you are filing them correctly, especially when you get a bit older like me and your eyesight's probably not as good as it used to be. But that's a useful thing to have in your kit. One of the things we use is a block of wood. Usually I make them about 3 inches long, and I recommend you make them that long. And these are for jamming the file in at the correct rake angle. Easily made. You just drill a hole from either side and then scribe a line at the correct rake angle. So on this side it's leaning that way, on the other side it's leaning that way. And I always put an arrow with an H there to tell me which end the handle is, so I make sure that I get the block of wood on my file in the correct way, and that the rake angle is facing in the right direction. And it's worth double checking that before you start filing, because it's easy to, in the heat of the moment, just pick up the block, put it on the file and start filing, and suddenly realise, oh dear, I'm filing the wrong way. So easily made, and there are now some alternatives to that block of wood, because you'll end up with a whole box full of those blocks of wood, which I've got somewhere. I couldn't lay my hands on it just now, but they're all different rake angles, so each piece of wood will have a different rake angle on it. Whereas this gauge from Veritas has a vernier gauge on the back for setting your rake angle, and a fleam gauge on the front for getting the fleam angle that you're filing correctly on crosscut saws. There's another alternative to that file holder that's available now from blackburntools.com. Isaac's done a great job there, making a lovely file holder, and with his you have the option of buying it with spirit level on the top, so you can really get your rake angle very accurate by watching the bubble in the vial on that spirit level before you start each stroke. I've adapted this little vial to fit over my fleam holder for this Veritas one. Haven't tried it out yet, but I see no reason why it won't work. need some kind of rule just for measuring the points per inch on your saw. Some saws, some hand saws, it actually states the number of points per inch on the heel of the saw plate. And sometimes if it's 6 points per inch or it's 9 points per inch, people get a bit confused because they don't know which way to read the number. Well, when you're reading the number, you always hold the saw with the handle to your body and read the number with the toe pointing away from you. And that way you've got the number the right way up, okay? But I would recommend that you still measure with a rule, because who's to say that somebody hasn't filed off the teeth since the saw was made and filed new teeth at different points per inch. So it's always worth measuring them. And then for jointing the tips of the teeth, you're going to need something like an 8-inch smooth file, and make yourself a file holder for jointing those teeth. And this ensures that you get the tops of the teeth nicely in line, and that's very important, particularly on back saws, that they really end up in a nice straight line. Here I've just routed out a groove, threaded some holes, put screws in there. There's a little piece of maple there that just clamps down onto the file, and the file's held in there by friction. And I made this so that I can use, I actually use two files. This is the smoothest file that I use, and I've got one that's a little bit coarser than this, depending on how much metal I need to remove from the tips of the teeth to sort the saw out and put it right. Sometimes when you're shaping on really old saws, the teeth can be in a right mess and you have to remove quite a lot of metal before you can start the shaping. I also use this larger file for hand saws with big teeth, again where I need to remove a lot of metal. This just makes a fast job of that. So I'll remove most of the metal, get myself in the right ballpark, and then I'll do a few finishing passes with the smoother file in the holder. And lastly, I've got a little diamond plate here which I use for jointing the sides of the teeth after they've been set, just to even up the set down the sides of the saw plate. This one's made by Trend. And that's it really, that's all you need and you'll be set. Okay, so that brings us to the end of the boring but I think absolutely necessary theory part. Now we get onto the practical side of this video. And as I said earlier, we're going to be looking at 4 scenarios, 2 back saws and 2 hand saws. And in the first scenario, I think it's a scenario that many woodworkers today face. And it's simply this, that you've gone out and you've treated yourself to a nice high-end saw, and you've been using it for a while, and it's time to resharpen it because you're noticing it isn't cutting as well as it did when you first bought it, when you first took it out of the packet. We live in a time now where we're really lucky to have so many great saw makers around again today. We've got Wensloff & Sons, Bad Axe, Two Lawyers, Blackburn Tools, Windsor Saws, Lee Nielsen, Adria, so many out there, and it's great to have choice again as a consumer. But tools don't stay sharp, you have to sharpen them. And this scenario to me represents the state you want to get to with all of your saws eventually. After you've sharpened your old saws that you've bought off of eBay, they're going to need resharpening again at some point. And the important thing here when you come to sharpen your saws is little and often. Little and often. Don't allow them to get really blunt. This saw is not really blunt. It's just not cutting as well as it did when I first bought it. Now, I've sharpened this saw once before. This is a Gramercy 12-inch carcass saw, filed rip. That's for cutting along the grain of the wood. So we're going to sharpen this saw up. Now, one of the things I found really useful when I first started sharpening my own saws was to try and visualize what it is I'm doing to the teeth. So a lot of people think that when you sharpen a saw, you sharpen the front face of the tooth, and they put pressure on the front face of the tooth. But the problem with that is that as you're filing the front face of the tooth, you're actually moving all the teeth along the tooth line towards the heel, and eventually you're going to end up with a space, a gap here at the toe, and one of the teeth at the heel is going to be pushed off the end. So what you want to do when you're sharpening is keep your pressure straight down, and then the teeth will stay in the same position. They might move a little bit, but not as much as if you were putting pressure on the front face of the tooth. So let me open my sketchbook, we'll zoom in, we'll have a look at these teeth, and I'll show you how they're configured, what the tooth geometry is on this saw, because it's important to understand the tooth geometry of the saw that you're about to sharpen. Okay, so here's an expanded view of the teeth as they are on the Gramercy ripsaw that we're about to sharpen in this first scenario. You can see that when the tooth line is held horizontally, the front face of the tooth is vertical. That's a zero rake angle. You'll notice that this is a cross section through the file, which is triangular, and you'll notice that we're only using half of one face here of the file and less than half of one face here of the file. And we're also using this edge down here in the gullet of the tooth. And that means that with each new file that you buy, you have three chances of using fresh edges and fresh faces, because when I've worn out half of this face and half of that face and this edge, I can rotate my file to use the other half of this face, that edge, and half of this face, and then I can rotate my file when that's worn out to use this half of that face, this half of this face, and this edge. So you've got three chances with each new file of using freshly sharpened filed teeth. Now, you notice over here I've noted down the direction of pressure, and the arrow is going straight down. So as I move my file across the teeth, I'm only going to be taking off the minimum amount of steel in this instance, because as I said earlier, this saw is not what I would call really blunt. It just needs touching up, just to freshen the edges. So as I file the back of one tooth, I'm bringing the top tip of each tooth back to sharp. I'm just freshening up this edge here, right at the corner, right at the tip of the teeth. Because that's the bit on the ripsaw that really does the cutting. Ripsaws act like a series of chisels paring the wood fibres away along the grain. And I've indicated in red, I don't know whether you can see it on the camera, but there's a thin red line here, and that's the material that needs to be removed. That's this steel that I'm going to be removing. And as I said, hardly any metal filings will be coming off in this scenario, because I'm just doing one light pass of the file. I have no wish to use any more steel up than I need to on this saw, just refresh the edge. But hopefully after seeing this you'll understand how easy it is just to touch up one of your nice back saws. So this is a 12 points per inch saw, or 11 teeth per inch if you prefer. Zero rake angle, and although it says 5-inch extra slim file here, I'm actually going to use a 5-inch double extra slim file, because that will give you a slightly deeper gullet. Okay, so I'll clear the sketchbook away, I'll get my saw vise out, we'll put the saw in the vise and we'll get cracking. Okay, let's start by talking about how you hold the file. Always use a file with a handle, much more control than trying to hold a file by its shank without having a handle on there. But just put the handle in the palm of your hand, curl your fingers around it, and extend your first finger along the handle and your thumb. And this gives you an enormous amount of control. Now I should say first off that I'm left-handed, make no apologies for that. If you're right-handed, you're going to have to reverse everything I do, okay? Shouldn't be too difficult for you. We left-handers have to do it every day. So you'll notice that since I'm left-handed, my handle of the saw is to my left. Okay? If you're right-handed, you will start with your handle to your right. Now, in terms of adjusting the angles that we use in saw sharpening, I'm going to use this little visual aid here. If I rotate my wrist while I'm holding the file, and I rotate it towards the handle, I'm adjusting the rake angle on the front face of the tooth. If I move my hand towards the handle of the saw, keeping the file horizontal, then I'm adjusting the fleam angle. That's the bevel angle on the front of the tooth, the fleam angle. And if I drop the handle down, then I'm adjusting the slope angle. That's the slope of the gullets. Now, I personally don't file any slope angle into my teeth. I think it really comes into its own if you're filing saws with bigger teeth for cutting wet wood or green wood, then it's worth doing it. But on back saws and hand saws that are used primarily for cutting seasoned hardwoods, I don't think it makes a significant difference. So I don't bother with it. I just file rake and fleam onto the teeth. They're the only two angles that I'm concerned with. And experiment with slope angles if you want to. There are those who would disagree with me, and that's fine. I personally haven't found that it makes enough of a difference for me to want to worry about it. So, like I say, we'll be concerned with getting our rake angle accurate and keeping it consistent as we file all of the teeth. And on this particular saw, remember, it's a 0 rake angle, so the front of the tooth is vertical. Now, how do I know when vertical is? Well, I'm working outside on grass. It's uneven ground, but even if you're working in a workshop, I recommend that when you set up your saw vise, you put a spirit level along the top. Make sure the vise is horizontal. And then when you clamp your saw into the vise, you want about anything from, 3/16 to 1/4 of an inch above the tops of the jaws of the vise, sticking out. Put the spirit level on the teeth and make sure that the saw itself is horizontal. Now, obviously, if you're first time you're sharpening a really old saw, the teeth could be way out of line anyway, so you wouldn't need to bother about it then. But in this case, this is a new high-end saw. I know for a fact, because I've tested it, that these teeth are already in a straight line. Okay. Now, the sharpening process, when you come to sharpen a saw, can contain up to 5 steps. They are: you start by jointing the teeth, then you shape the teeth, then you set the teeth, then you lightly joint the teeth again after shaping and setting, and then you sharpen the teeth. Okay, so you joint, shape, set, lightly joint, and sharpen. And if you're one of these people that likes to remember things by acronyms, then just remember JUZLS. But the thing to point out, that I want to point out in this first scenario at least, is that you don't always have to do all 5 steps with any particular saw. And in this case, because all I'm doing is touching up the teeth and refreshing the edge, all I have to do is this sharpen. I know that the teeth are all in line. I don't even have to joint them. Okay, I don't have to shape them. They're all nicely formed. There's plenty of set left on the teeth already, because this is only the second time I've touched the teeth up. And I don't. So the only step I need to perform in this scenario is to sharpen the teeth. In the future scenarios, we'll be looking at all of these steps. But I just want to show you this first scenario with a high-end saw, just refreshing the edge, because it's really easy to do, and there's really, to my mind, no excuse why hobbyist woodworkers can't do this themselves. Okay, so I've set my Veritas file holder to 0 degrees of rake. So that means that the face of the file closest to the handle is now vertical. As long as I keep this fleam guide horizontal. Okay, and as I said earlier, some woodworkers like to put a little spirit level on here, and you can watch the bubble and make sure that you're really homed in on horizontal. So I've also taped some card to the top jaws of my vise, and these have a series of parallel lines running at right angles to the saw plate, and that helps me maintain a right angle with my file, because I'm not filing any fleam into these teeth, I'm filing straight across. And that's the reason why I left these flats next to the actual saw plate, so that I could put these templates on there for different fleam angles for different teeth. Okay, so all I'm going to do in this instance, just refresh the teeth. I'm just going to take one pass with the file on each tooth. I'm only using a very light pressure. As I said, I don't want to remove any more steel than I need to. And this saw isn't what I would call blunt. Just needs freshening up. If your eyesight isn't as good as it used to be, then feel free to use a magnifying glass. I do use a magnifying glass on a gooseneck that sits on my bench, and I can bend it to the shape that I want it, and that really helps with the smaller teeth. Remember that the pressure is straight down, although it's a very light pressure in this instance. Even though there's set on this particular saw on the teeth, and the teeth are bending in alternate directions, because the teeth are so small and the set is not very much, I'm able to sharpen all the teeth from one side of the saw plate. And that's it. How easy was that? Didn't take very long, did it? As I say, I don't think there's any reason why most hobbyist woodworkers can't do this. As long as your eyesight is reasonable. I'm actually wearing glasses now. I wear glasses for reading. But it's all about developing a feel for using the file. Okay, same amount of pressure on each tooth. Get the direction of the pressure right for the saw that you're filing and what you're trying to do to it. And you'll maintain the teeth in the same position, or more or less in the same position, without moving them along the tooth line and without changing their shape. Keep your angles consistent. Watch your fleam marks. I'm not actually filing any fleam, so I'm filing straight across, okay, but I've still got the marks there to help me do that with this template. And you know, end of a woodworking day, touch your saw up, put it back in the saw till, and it's ready for tomorrow in pristine, sharp condition. Okay, now for the fun part where we get to try out the saw after we've sharpened it. When I use a back saw, I like to pinch my thumb and my first finger together and use the tips of my thumb and first finger to rest on the side of the plate, and that gives me a very solid surface to support the saw when I'm starting the cut. And by flexing the joints in my thumb and first finger, I can actually move the saw to position it exactly where I want it on my mark. Of course, in this instance it doesn't matter, because all we're doing is testing the saw on a bit of scraps of peeling. So let's see how it cuts. Well, I'm happy with that. So, as you saw, this time all I did was sharpen the teeth. Didn't have to joint them, I didn't have to set the teeth, and I'll probably get another 2, maybe 3 sharpenings, just doing the same thing. Eventually though, I'm going to have to set the teeth. I'm going to have to joint the teeth. You probably want to do it, probably want to joint the teeth every, say, 4 sharpenings. I'll probably do that. Just a light jointing. Again, it's all about maintaining the teeth shape rather than letting the saw get into disrepair and then having to put a lot of problems right. Keep it right. That's the name of the game here. In scenario 2, we're going to look at a 26-inch rip saw made by W. Tysick, Sons and Turner, and this is 5.5 points per inch, and we're going to be filing it with an 8-degree rake angle on the front of the tooth. Now this saw has some issues. If you look carefully at the photo, you can see that the gullets are different depths, and the points of the teeth are not all in a line, so not all of these teeth are doing their job. You can also see, if you look carefully, that the rake angle on the front of the teeth varies from tooth to tooth. So there's a number of issues that we have to put right here. And this, what you're seeing here, is actually known as cows and calves. Don't ask me why. But it is. It's known as cows and calves historically. Some people call it big teeth, little teeth. But anyone who has filed saws has had this problem at one point or another. And they probably stood back when they realised that they had it and said, how the heck did that happen? Me included. So let's have a look at the sketchbook, and I'll take you through what I think are the 3 main steps in sorting out a saw that has big teeth, little teeth. Okay, so here we are at scenario 2 for this 26-inch rip saw, and I've detailed how we're going to fix this problem in 3 steps. So let's have a look at step 1, which shows the teeth more or less as they are now on the saw, and you can see that some of the points don't meet the point line, and some of the gullets don't meet the baseline. So the gullets are uneven and the points are uneven. Now it might also be the case that the rake angles vary from tooth to tooth as well, because typically this problem of big teeth, little teeth, or cows and calves, whatever you want to call it, happens because the filer has not paid enough attention to either the direction of pressure with their file or keeping their rake angle consistent from tooth to tooth. I would suspect that this saw, although it's a rip saw, because it's got big teeth and they would have been set on the teeth so the teeth are bending out to either side alternately, I would suspect that he had filed this saw from either side, so alternate teeth from either side of the saw. And in coming round to the other side of the saw, he's either got the direction of pressure with his file wrong, or he's rotated the file slightly and got the rake angle wrong. Either way, he's created points that are lower than the teeth next to them and gullets that are higher than the teeth next to them. So how do we go about putting this right? In this scenario, for this particular saw that we're doing now, this is how we're going to put it right. The first stage is to take our file and make a number of swipes from the heel to the toe of the saw to remove the tips of the teeth. That's this red area here that I've indicated in the diagram. So that will leave us with flats on the top of the teeth. And typically in big teeth, little teeth, you're going to end up with a short flat, then a longer flat, then a short flat, then a longer flat, etc., etc. Okay, so that's step 1. Step 2 involves filing the back of the teeth with the wider flats. And the direction of pressure with our file that I've indicated by these blue arrows is parallel to the front of the tooth next to the back that we're filing. Okay, so we're coming straight down there, not removing anything or very little off of this face, just off the back of this tooth with the wider flat. In doing that, what we'll end up with is flats that are the same width. And at the same time, because we're putting pressure down there, we will extend the gullets down to the baseline. So at the end of step 2, we will end up with gullets that all touch our baseline and flats with the same width. Step 3 involves filing the front and the back of each tooth so that we bring these flats to a point. And generally speaking, the direction of pressure here will be straight down, just as it is in sharpening the teeth. But depending on whether we need to space the teeth out to arrive at equally spaced points, we might have to put pressure slightly on the back or slightly on the front of the tooth. And we'll see what we need to do when we get to actually filing the saw. But hopefully we can put the pressure straight down. That will give us a new baseline at the bottom of the red area here, where all the gullets touch our new baseline. It will also give us a new point line, because the teeth that we end up with are indicated by the white area that we're left with. Okay, and we'll have equally spaced teeth, equal height to the gullets, equal height to the points, and then we'll know that the shaping stage of putting this saw right is complete. Now this is a 5.5 points per inch saw, and we're going to be filing it with an 8-degree rake angle. And for that we're going to use a 7-inch slim file. If you remember, we said that there were 5 steps to the saw sharpening process. You joint the teeth, you shape the teeth, you set the teeth, then you lightly joint the teeth again, and then you sharpen the teeth. So here we are at step 1 of that process. So I've got my saw sitting up out of the vise so that this face of my file holder can ride along the side of the saw plate and keep my file flat and true along the teeth as I file. Okay? So I'm just going to knock the points off of these teeth with this file, then I'll see if I can file some of the material away with my larger file. If not, I'll come back to this, but this will take a bit longer. So start by just knocking off the points from the teeth, keeping the file square to the plate. People often wonder how much they should joint the teeth. Well, if the teeth are in pretty good shape and the gullets are at equal depth and the points are all in a straight line, then you'll probably get away with 2 or 3 passes of the file, which should be enough just to touch up the shape of the teeth. But on this saw, as we've seen, the gullets are at different heights and the points of the teeth are at different heights, and I think the rake angles are slightly varied as well. So I'm actually going to take off the difference between the shallower gullets and the deeper gullets. So whatever that difference is, that's how much I'm taking off the tops of the teeth, and I'm hoping that should be enough for me to put all the problems right. But you know, if you find that you haven't jointed the saw enough, well, you can always joint it again. And sometimes you can buy an old saw from eBay or from a flea market or something, and the tooth line is like that, and so you can't do enough jointing to put all of the problem right in one go. Sometimes you have to joint it twice and shape the teeth more than once in order to get to all the teeth. Now, the purpose of jointing, as a minimum, you need to joint the teeth so that the file has touched the top of each tooth along the point line. Okay, because only then can you know that all of the teeth will be in a straight line. I'll try this bigger file. I'm not sure if I'll be able to do it, but we'll try it. Finish up with a few passes with the finer file to ensure I get the tops of the teeth square to the plate. Okay, I think that should do us. And I can see that when I look at the tops of these teeth and the flats that we've just created with that file, I can see that they vary in length. And generally speaking, we've got a wider flat and a thinner flat and a wider flat and a thinner flat, and lots of variations between the two. In short, a right mess. Okay guys, there's been a change of plan. I started to shape the teeth at the heel end, as you can see here, but what I found was that when I was restoring the correct tooth spacing of 5.5 points per inch, when I started to see how that was going to work out further down the saw plate towards the toe, I found that where I wanted some of the points, I had gullets of the original teeth, because the original teeth were so poorly spaced out that I couldn't actually file the teeth such that I could bring them back to the correct spacing. And this is real world scenario. This is the kind of thing that happens when you buy old saws. Some of them are so out of whack that it calls for some drastic action. So what I'm going to have to do is file off the old teeth. And as you can see, I've stuck a template onto the saw, and I've taken the opportunity to move the teeth towards the toe, because I had quite a lot of metal right at the tip of the toe there, so I've introduced another tooth into that area. So I'm moving the teeth towards the toe. I created a template in Google SketchUp, printed it off, actual size, spliced all the sheets of A4 paper together, and stuck it onto my saw plate with double-sided tape, taking care to get the teeth nice and straight. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to joint the rest of the existing teeth off, and then I'll bring you back in and show you how you actually file in new teeth into a saw plate. If you're worried about filing saws on your workbench that you use for woodwork, then here's what I'd recommend: that you clear the bench off first, sweep off any sawdust and shavings, and then file your saw. Afterwards, get yourself a Ziploc bag and a magnet, turn the Ziploc bag inside out, put the magnet inside it, pass it over everywhere that you've been filing, wherever all the filings are. The magnet will attract the filings, and then you turn the bag the right way out, do it up, retrieve the magnet, and throw the bag in the bin. Okay, so the next stage in putting this saw right now is for me to file new teeth. Okay, so I've got my 7-inch slim file. I've got my Veritas file holder set to 8 degrees of rake, and I've started filing in the new teeth following my template, which is stuck to the side of the plate. Now, the top of the plate at the moment is smooth. There are no teeth there to guide where I'm filing, and when you try to file across a flat surface like that, the file has a tendency to skid. So what I've found is that I put it somewhere between the 2 points and lift the handle slightly for the first 2 or 3 strokes, so you're filing off the back edge, and then as you establish a groove, then lower the handle and get back to horizontal, and the file then has a groove to follow, so it won't skid along the plate. I'm watching my template all the time, and the 2 lines defining the back of the tooth that I'm filing and the front of the next tooth that I'm filing. And I will vary the pressure either onto the back of the tooth, that's straight down, or left onto the front of the tooth if I need to even up where the tooth is being placed on the plate. You'll notice that I'm lifting my file off of the saw plate on the return stroke. Some people drag the file back, and I would recommend you don't do that. You're going to halve the life of your file if you do that. Don't drag the file back over the steel. The teeth on a file are made to cut in one direction, and that is forward. If you drag it back, you're just going to blunt the teeth. The file will be cut less efficiently and last half as long. Incidentally, it's always a good idea when you're filing or shaping your teeth to start at the handle end, because any repetitive task takes a while to get into the stride, and if you're going to mess any teeth up, then mess the ones up under the handle, because they don't get used when you're sawing. So always a good idea to start at the handle end. I'm using a paper template here that I created in Google SketchUp, but a professional saw sharpener would either punch the teeth out on a machine to get the shape, which is a lot quicker. The problem with that is it can introduce a slight wave into the saw plate. Not an issue, it's easily sorted. Some professional sharpeners, though, they do actually shape the teeth by hand, and they use metal templates which they clamp in their vise next to the saw plate, or just below where they're shaping the teeth, so they can follow the outline of their template. And they'll have a number of those templates for different pitches of teeth, different points per inch. I'm always ducking my head and looking at the lines, make sure I don't go over the lines, watching my angles, keeping the file horizontal this way and at right angles to the saw plate. These ripped teeth are always filed straight across, and even when you're shaping the teeth on a crosscut saw, you always file at right angles to the saw plate to shape the teeth. Hooray! Now I've shaped all of the teeth. The next stage is to set the teeth, so we'll be getting to that next. Okay, so I've taken the remainder of the template off. You'll probably find if you stick a paper template onto a saw plate with double-sided tape, it holds very well and it stays there while you file it, but when you peel it off, some of the glue residue will be left behind. All I do is get some white spirit, kitchen towel, just wipe it over. After about 30 seconds the glue will dissolve and you can just wipe it straight off, comes off, leaves no trace. Okay, so I've got the saw sitting up in my saw vise here, and now it's time to set the teeth. Now setting, as I mentioned earlier when we were talking about the tools you need, refers to bending alternate teeth either side of the saw plate to create a wider curve than the thickness of the saw plate. That gives you clearance for the saw to pass down into the cut when you're sawing. Now before you go and apply any set, you need to know how much set to apply. So the first thing you need to do is measure the thickness of your saw plate. So I've got a micrometer here. You could use a vernier calipers for this as well. And I've got just under 39 thousandths of an inch, and I measure it at the toe end as well. And there I've got 38 thousandths of an inch. So I'm going to use 39. So how much set is enough? Well, as a general rule, if you're going to use the saw for cutting hardwoods, then you want to add a set roughly about 20% of the thickness of the saw plate. If you're going to be cutting softwoods, then you want 25 to 30% of the thickness of the saw plate. Okay, so I've adjusted my saw set to give me, I'm going for about, shooting for about 46 thousandths of an inch. So the saw plate is 39, I'm shooting for 46, which gives me 3.5 thousandths of an inch either side of the saw plate. One of the things I like to do when I'm setting is I use a permanent marker, and I mark every other tooth along the saw plate. because it's very easy when you're looking down this little window here in the saw set to get the wrong tooth and bend it in the wrong direction. Now, because I've filed new teeth into this saw, it doesn't matter which way I choose to bend the alternate teeth when I'm using the set. But if you're just sharpening a saw that's got existing set on it, then you want to add the set in the same way that the teeth have been bent before. Don't try and bend them back the other way because you might break them off. Okay, so always bend them in the same way that they're bent already. So this type of saw set is referred to as a plier type saw set. It's got two plungers. The first plunger, the bigger of the two, comes out and grips the saw plate, and then the smaller plunger in the middle of that presses the teeth and bends it against the anvil at the back. Now the anvil, you can rotate that to give you more set or less set. There are numbers on there, but they don't equate to the number of teeth on your saw. Okay, so don't think they do. You just adjust the saw set, try it on the teeth at the heel first, because they don't do any cutting, so it doesn't matter if you get the set wrong there, but try it on the teeth at the heel of the saw and just keep adjusting it until you get the amount of set that you're interested in. So I place the saw set over the first tooth and I make sure that the little plunger in the middle lines up with the tooth, and just give it a gentle squeeze, gentle but firm. Skip a tooth, move on to the third tooth, gentle squeeze. Move on to the fifth tooth, gentle squeeze. Seventh tooth, gentle squeeze. And so on, all down one side of the saw plate. Make sure that the plunger hits the teeth in exactly the same place on each tooth. When you're moving from one tooth to the next tooth, don't drag the saw set along the teeth. Lift it up slightly and then position it. If you do drag it, you'll create a groove underneath here, and then the saw set won't line up on the teeth properly. So just lift it slightly and move it to the next tooth. Finish one side, you walk around the other side of the saw or turn it round in your vise, and then you set the teeth in the other direction, ones you didn't set on the first pass. The tooth should bend no lower than halfway down the tooth. Don't want it to bend from the bottom of the teeth, because you could introduce stress cracks around the gallets. So no lower than halfway down the tooth. That's it. That's all there is to setting. Just make sure that you get the same amount of pressure when you squeeze the trigger, and your set should end up more or less equal. After we've jointed and sharpened the teeth, we will dress the sides of the teeth with a diamond stone, just to even up the set after we've sharpened the teeth. Okay, so now we're going to lightly joint the teeth prior to sharpening the teeth. Now, some people think that if you've shaped the teeth well and you've set the teeth, you're done, aren't you, on the rip saw? Well, actually no. If you imagine these two pieces of paper are two teeth along the saw plate. They've got a nice flat top, haven't they? And then we apply set. Look what happens to the top of the pieces of paper. If you were to use this saw now, the shape at the top of these two pieces of paper is the shape that is going to be at the bottom of your saw cut. So we joint the teeth again after setting to bring the tops of the teeth back to level, flat.
and then we sharpen them. Jointing also has another advantage prior to sharpening, because typically when you're shaping the teeth, as accurate as you try to be, you're bound to have introduced a slight error on a few of the teeth at least. So just a light joint now will just even them out again, and then we can just home in on a perfectly straight point line when we sharpen. So I'm just going to use my smoothing file in my file holder and just do 2 or 3 passes, working again from the heel to the toe. Just looking to see that the file has made contact with the tips of all of the teeth, and it has, so I can stop now. That's as far as I need to go. I've just levelled that point line up. Okay, so now we're at the final stage of sharpening this saw. The little flats on the tips of the teeth that jointing has created are called shiners, and they're called shiners because when you're sharpening you duck your head down such that the little flats catch the light, and you file until the shiners just disappear and no further. If you go any further, then you're making that tooth lower than the teeth around it. So it needs to just disappear, and don't file any more after that. Keep the point line straight. So probably 2, maybe 3 passes with the file is going to bring this back to really sharp, and we'll have a nice straight point line. Don't forget, when you're sharpening now, the pressure, direction of pressure is straight down. I don't need to shape my teeth, I've done that, they're perfect. So I'm just sharpening them, filing the back of the tooth, just to bring them up to sharp. That's it, all nicely sharpened. I test the sharpness of the teeth, not just by cutting wood, but I see if it catches the skin on my hand. It should pull the skin. One final step before we test the saw out is to just lightly dress the teeth with a fine diamond stone. That's what I use anyway. Some people use oil stones, I believe, as well. So I've got a very fine diamond stone, and I'm just going to run it from the heel to the toe, once down each side, just to even up the set on the saw. For me, this is the best part of saw sharpening, getting to try out a saw that you just sharpened, a saw that was made in the 1920s by W. Tyzack, Sons and Turner, number 3 handsaw, file grip. Let's see how she cuts. So, here we go. I should say actually, I tried this off camera and I found that 3.5 thousandths of an inch of set either side of the saw blade wasn't quite enough, so I've increased that to 4.5 thousandths. So let's give it a go now. Some people find it hard to start a handsaw, particularly one with big teeth like this.
But the trick to it is to take the weight of the saw, so don't let the weight of the saw press down into the wood. Hold the weight off until you've established the kerf in the wood, and then you can apply some more pressure. So 4.5 thousandths of an inch set was much better than 3.5 thousandths of an inch. Doesn't sound like much of a difference, does it? But it does make a difference. And the nice thing about sharpening your own saws is that you can adjust them. So if the amount of set you've applied isn't enough, you can always add a bit more. Nice saw. As we say in the UK, that is a nice bit of kit.
If you find when you test your saw that the saw is veering off to one side as you cut and you're sure it's not your technique, then take your diamond stone and dress the teeth again on the side that it's veering off to. Okay, so if it's pulling to the left, you do this side. If it's pulling to the right, you do this side. Just one pass, try the saw again. But make sure it's not your technique first.
In the first two scenarios we looked at sharpening rib saws, and in scenarios 3 and 4 we'll be looking at sharpening cross-cut saws. Now, I had every intention of sharpening this lovely Diston number 7, which is a 10-point saw, 10 points per inch, but I haven't had a chance to restore it yet, and I'm not going to rush it just to get this video done. It's got a number of splits in the handle that I'm going to have to glue up, and it's not a quick restore, so we'll save that one for a later date. And instead I'm going to downsize, and we're going to do this little Diston D8 panel saw, which is 19.5 inches long and is 12 points per inch. You can see that this saw has the skew back design. It was 20 inches long, but when I bought it, before I cleaned the plate up, the end of the plate, the last half an inch, was badly bent. Looked like somebody had opened a tin of paint with it, to be honest, and there was nothing I could do about it, so I filed that off. So it's now 19.5 inches long, but I think it's going to be a sweet little saw when it's done. You can see it hasn't got the handle on at the moment. The last coat of finish is drying on the handle at the moment, so we'll marry them up again later on when we do a test cut. So I'll be sharpening this one without the handle. So let's have a look at the sketchbook, and I'll show you how the tooth geometry is on this saw. So here in this scenario, you can see that the rake angle on the front of the tooth is going to slope back at an angle of 12 degrees, and I'll be filing the fleam, that's the bevel on the front of the tooth, at an angle of 20 degrees. So this is a cross-cut saw, and the handle is in that direction. So this is a 19.5 inch D8 panel saw, and I'll be using a 5 inch double extra slim file. Now, when I joint the tips of the teeth off of this saw, I expect, because this is a really old saw and the teeth are very worn, I expect that I will get a variation in the length of the flats that I end up with. And I'm going to have to move some of the teeth to get my spacing back to, I believe it's 12 points per inch on this saw. So I'm going to be demonstrating a technique which is called crowding, which is where you move effectively the point of the tooth to a different position to get the spacing back between the teeth and to get it back to being consistent. So have a look for that. I'll try and get the camera in close so that you can see exactly what I'm doing. When I get down and I sight along the saw, I can see that the top of the saw, the top of the teeth are pretty straight until it gets to about here, and then it starts to come up a bit. So when I joint this saw, I'm going to take a few short swipes just at the end here, bring that down to the same height as the rest of the teeth, and then I'll take some couple of full passes. That's all this should need, I think, on this saw. That's got it. Now take some full length passes. I'm watching the tips of the teeth to make sure the file has made contact with the tops of all of the teeth. And I see that there's a few just here that still haven't been touched by the file, so a couple more passes on it. Sight down the teeth again, make sure I'm keeping it straight. Yeah. That's got it. Right, so now all the teeth are at the same level and we've got a nice straight point line, which is important. So the next stage is to shape the teeth. Okay, after jointing the teeth, you can see the shiners that I was talking about on top, the little flats that we've created with our file. And I don't know whether you can make out, but the very first flat is quite short. The next flat is longer, quite a bit longer. So I'm going to have to move this second tooth towards the toe, that way, and space all the teeth out correctly. Most of them are pretty well spaced anyway, so I don't think this is going to be arduous work. But this is our shaping stage, so stage 2 of the saw sharpening process. I haven't bothered to mark the teeth with my permanent marker because the gullets of the teeth are rusty anyway, so you know that's having the same effect as a permanent marker would on shiny teeth. Okay, so I've got my file holder set to 12 degrees of rake. And remember, when we shape the teeth, we always file at 90 degrees to the plate, so perpendicular to the saw plate. Now, when I file each tooth, I like to concentrate on individual teeth. Some saw filers work on pairs of teeth at a time, and others take one swipe on each tooth and move along the plate, then they'll come back and take another swipe and move along the plate. And you'll find the method that works best for you. I personally like to concentrate on a single tooth and get that more or less right as I go along. So what I'm going to be doing is filing the front, then the back, then the front, then the back, and when I apply my pressure, I will be applying it on the back of the tooth in the direction of the rake angle of the tooth behind it, and when I apply pressure onto the front of the tooth, I will be applying it in the direction that the back of the tooth is sloped at. Okay, so I'm never going completely horizontally, because what that would do is widen the gullet, and then your file will just be sloppy in the gullet. Your file should always fit nicely in the gullet, so you always file in the direction of the back of the tooth or in the direction of the front of the tooth, depending on whether you're filing the back or the front of the tooth. So I'm going to take one swipe on the back, one swipe on the front, and we'll bring the tooth back to a point. Okay, so I'm actually going to start on the second tooth here, because this is the one I've got to just move the point towards the toe. So I'm going to start by taking a few swipes on the back of the tooth to try and even up where the point of that tooth is going to end up being placed. front of the tooth. Back of the tooth, front of the tooth, back of the tooth, front of the tooth. Now before I get it right to a point, I'm going to move on to the next 2 or 3 teeth, because they're equally spaced as it is, so I'll bring them to a point and I'll eye up the spacing between the points on those teeth, and then I'll bring this one to the same spacing as those teeth. Front and back of the tooth alternately. Ducking my head slightly to look at the shiners. Make sure I don't go past the level that the shiner is at now. I don't want to take the tooth lower and end up with an uneven point line. Okay, so I try to keep it nice and straight. We will be jointing it again before we sharpen the teeth, but let's try and keep it as straight as we can all the way through the process. Front of the tooth, back of the tooth, front of the tooth, back of the tooth. What you'll find is that if you concentrate on getting the teeth equally spaced and you don't go lower than the shiner height, you'll find that the gullets will take care of themselves. They'll end up at an equal height. Okay? So as long as you get the tooth spacing correct, you maintain your angles, and you don't go past the point line that you've established while jointing, the gullets will end up at a consistent depth. So I don't have to concentrate on my gullets while I'm doing this. I'm just looking at my tooth spacing, and then I bring the shiners to a nice point, but don't go any further. You'll find when you file old teeth that haven't been filed for years and years and years that your file will catch on the first 2 or 3 strokes. You just got to push through it, maintain your angles. You know, you're in control of the file. You've got to impose your will on the file. Okay, don't let the file deviate from its path. Try to maintain it, cutting the way you want it to, maintaining your angles all the time. Okay, so I use my fingers because your sense of touch is very sensitive. So you can always feel, if you run your fingers lightly along the tops of the teeth, whether you've got one that's prouder than the others or one that's lower than the others. But I think I'm good in this instance. I've managed to keep a straight point line. So the next stage for us now is to set the teeth. Okay, so I've got my saws sitting up higher in the saw vise again so that I can apply the set. I've marked every other tooth with my permanent marker, and I really recommend you do this because it's so easy to bend the wrong tooth the wrong way. And I liken this really to taking the trouble to mark the waist when you're cutting dovetails. You know, it's a similar kind of thing really. You don't have to do it. It's not an absolutely necessary step, but it's well worthwhile because sooner or later you will bend the tooth the wrong way. And this just makes it so much easier to ensure you've got it correct. So I mark every other tooth, and then I carefully run my eye along the tooth line just to make sure I've actually marked the right teeth, every other tooth. Okay, I've measured with my micrometer the thickness of this saw plate,
and it's 32 thousandths of an inch thick. Measured it at the toe and at the heel. And I've adjusted my saw set. I've got the one with the red paint now, which is for finer teeth. And I've adjusted it to give me 2.5 thousandths of an inch set either side of the saw plate. Now this saw plate, even though it is a small panel saw, it is taper ground, so that is working in conjunction with the amount of set that I apply to the teeth to provide enough clearance for the saw to pass down into the kerf of the cut. Okay, so now it's just a case of going along all the teeth that I've marked with my permanent marker on one side, and then the other teeth that I haven't marked from the other side, just like we did before. So I've done the first few teeth. I'll just move along, setting the rest of the teeth. Try and keep your squeeze on the trigger consistent, same amount of pressure, and make sure that the little plunger that sets the tooth is lined up in the same place on each tooth. Don't forget to lift your saw set as you travel from tooth to tooth so you don't create a groove in the two little wings that support the set on the tips of the teeth. Okay, so that's the setting done. Now we get to joint the teeth and then sharpen them. Okay, so I've got my file in my file holder here, and I'm just going to joint the teeth prior to sharpening them. And remember, the purpose of this now is not to remove a lot of metal. If you did your job properly when you were shaping and you didn't go below the point line that you'd established when you jointed previously, you should only have to do 1 or 2 swipes of the file now. Just lightly take the tops off the teeth, and this just helps you ensure that you keep the point line straight when you sharpen it. If there was any teeth that are slightly lower or slightly higher, this jointing will take care of them now. So keep my file square to the side of the saw plate. And I run my eye along the tips of the teeth to make sure that the file has made contact with the tops of each tooth. If I need to, I duck my head down so that the shiners catch the light. And as I look along the tooth line now, I can see that I've touched each of the teeth and the shiners are a consistent width. So that means that we've got a good straight point line prior to sharpening. So I'm just ensuring that the saw is level in my vise. I've got my spirit level sitting on the top of the teeth. I'm just making sure that I'm absolutely level, and I am. Because there's little point in trying to hold consistent angles with your file if your saw is not level. Okay, because the angles that you think you're filing are not actually the angles that you are filing. So we've got it level. I've got my rake angle set to 12 degrees still, and this time I've adjusted my fleam guide to 20 degrees. And I'm going to start filing from this side, and I file the front of each tooth that is bending away from me. Okay, and at the same time I'm bending the back of the tooth that is bending towards me. Now, because it is easier to file a tooth bending away from you, you will need to bias your file ever so slightly onto the back of the tooth bending towards you. Okay, and that way you should keep your spacing consistent, and you want to file until you just reach the back of the tooth. So the bevel that you're filing just reaches the back of the tooth.
Now how do I know when that is? Because these are pretty small teeth. So what I'm going to do initially is just mark the tops of the teeth with this thicker permanent marker. Okay, so I've got all the tops of my teeth coloured with the black permanent markers. So now as I file, I'm filing away the black marker and I can see the fresh steel underneath that. And I can see that if there's a little bit of black left at the back of the tooth, then I need to take another swipe with my file to get rid of it, to bring the edge to sharp. Now, I've set my Phleem guide to 20 degrees, as I said. So now when the Phleem guide is parallel to my saw plate, my file is at an angle of 20 degrees. I also have this Phleem guide taped to the flats alongside the saw plate on my saw vise. Now the reason for that is because when I start my stroke, this Phleem guide helps me keep that 20-degree angle, but when I get to the end of my stroke, that Phleem guide is quite away from my saw. So it's difficult to know whether you're actually at 20 degrees or 22 degrees or 24 degrees, whatever. So having the lines here directly below the file help me keep the file at the correct angle when I sight down from above. Okay, so let's start filing, and this is where you want a light touch and bias the file slightly onto the back of the tooth leaning towards you. So don't forget, I'm filing the front edge of the tooth leaning away from me and the back edge of the tooth leaning towards me. And 2 or 3 light strokes is all it takes. Now I skip a tooth and file the next tooth that is leaning away from me. Skip a tooth, file the next tooth leaning away from me. Skip a tooth. And it's good to count your strokes here. Keep the pressure the same, count your strokes. I'm going to use 3 strokes, it seems like that is enough to give me my bevel angle. And the number of strokes varies according to the thickness of the saw plate and also the steel that you're filing. Actually, this is a Diston panel saw, and Diston steel is it's really good quality steel. Some saws by other manufacturers, you'll find that the steel is a bit softer, and so it doesn't necessarily take as many strokes of the file. So go easy to start with, see how much metal you're removing, and then use the same number of strokes on every other tooth right down the saw plate. Incidentally, if you were filing slope into your teeth, and as I mentioned earlier, I don't bother with slope, you would tilt the file down so you'd be maintaining 3 angles, your rake angle, your Phleem angle, and your slope angle. Okay, and then you'd be filing up. If you're using one of the metal saw vices, then some of those saw vices tilt away from you so that you can get your angle that way. Sorry about the aeroplane. What can you do? So the vice tilts away from you so you can file your slope, but you'll be filing with a horizontal file and still get your slope angle. Okay, but I'm not filing slope into these teeth. That's one side complete. Now we'll go around the other side and I'll show you how to file those teeth. Okay, so now I've come around the other side, I've got to adjust my rake angle so that
this face of the file is now at an angle of 12 degrees, so the front of the tooth is at 12 degrees. I also have to adjust my fleam guide so that instead of going this way, it goes that way, okay, because I'm filing from the other side. So I'll swing that round to 20 degrees in the other direction. Knock it off. Now I can start filing the teeth that I didn't file before. So that's all the black teeth. So every other tooth at the moment is still black, okay, because I've only filed every other tooth from the other side. So this time it's exactly the same thing, but it might feel a bit weird to you when you go around the other side of your saw and file from a side that is not well, it doesn't feel as good as the side you started from. So your hand position might feel a bit weird, but don't worry. Same number of strokes, same amount of pressure. Bias the file onto the back of the tooth that you're filing, okay? And you're filing the front of the tooth now that is bending away from you in that direction, okay? When we get to do the next crosscut saw, I'll show you how you can judge your fleam if you don't have one of these Veritas file holders. We'll look at a few alternatives that you've got there. So at the start of each stroke, take a moment to make sure your angles are okay. You're keeping the file level. Well, here's the finished plate, guys. We've kept the point line straight. If I sight down the point line, I can see that the tips of the teeth are in a nice straight line. Got the consistent rake angle, consistent fleam angle. I can't wait to get the handle back on this saw now and take it for a test drive. Well, here she is. Let's take her for a test drive. I think that one's a keeper. By the way, after you sharpen your saws and you're trying them out, vary the angle that you're cutting at and see what works best. You'll hear people tell you that when you're using a rip saw, you should have the teeth at a 60-degree angle to the wood that you're cutting, and if you're using a cross-cut saw, you should have them at 45 degrees, but I don't think that's always right, because it depends on the saw, it depends on the tooth geometry that you've sharpened it at. So vary the angle and find what works best. Now, I mentioned at the start of this video that I bought a load of back saws and restored them and then started teaching myself to sharpen them. Well, I sharpened some for cross-cutting, I sharpened some for ripping, and then I thought I'd try sharpening the saws for combination saws, or hybrid saws as they're sometimes called. And that's a saw that will both rip and cross-cut acceptably, but won't do either as good as a dedicated cross-cut saw or a dedicated rip saw. But I thought, you know, I'll have a go. So I sharpened this 14-inch Drabble & Sanderson with a 10-degree rake angle and 10 degrees of fleam. And I sharpened this 12-inch Spear & Jackson Leapfrog brand saw for a 10-degree rake angle and 17.5 degrees of fleam. And I also relaxed the rake at the first few inches, couple of inches, and again at the heel. And after using them, I thought to myself, do you know what, I don't really like hybrid saws, and I don't really need to have hybrid saws because I've got enough saws to dedicate them to cross-cutting and ripping, and I've got enough to sharpen them at different tooth geometries for different types of wood, different situations.
So I'm going to change this saw and the way it's filed. I'm going to make it 14 degrees of rake and 20 degrees of fleam. So let's have a look at the sketchbook and I'll show you what we need to do to these teeth in order to change them from what they are at the moment to what I want them to be in the future. So in the first drawing you can see the old geometry with a 10-degree rake angle and 17.5 degrees of fleam. In the second drawing here, where I've already jointed the tips of the teeth off, and I think I'm going to have to joint off about 1/4 of the tooth height in order to give myself enough room to be able to move the rake angle back to 14 degrees and move the back of the tooth round accordingly. So the pink area shows the material that is going to be coming off, and this is a scenario where you have to impose your will on that file because it's going to want to follow the old tooth geometry. So you're going to have to hold your angle steady, your rake angle steady, until that file gets established and starts cutting at the new 14-degree rake angle. So this is a Spear & Jackson 12-inch back saw. It's a Leapfrog brand, and I'm going to be using a 5-inch double extra slim file. This 5-inch double extra slim file is getting a bit of a workout in this video, isn't it? I do use other sizes as well. It just so happens that the saws I'm demonstrating on require a 5-inch double extra slim file. So I'll clear the sketchbook away, get the vise out, get the saw in the vise, and I'll joint off the tips of the teeth. I don't think you need to see that again. And then I'll bring you back in when we start doing the shaping. Okay, so in this scenario I thought I'd forego the Veritas file holder that you've seen me using in the first 3 scenarios, and I'll revert back to what I started with, and that's a block of wood on the end of my file. And I thought I'd just quickly show you how to make that. So I've got a block of wood that's about 3 inches long by about 1 inch wide by about 9/16 thick. The dimensions don't have to be exact, you know, any scrap piece of wood. I prefer softwood because I think the file catches it easier, but hardwood could be used as well. So what I've done, as you can see here, I found the centre of the wood and I've gone 1/8 either side of the centre, and I've followed those lines round onto the edge, and then I've pricked a hole somewhere about in the centre. I've done that on both sides, and I've marked the direction where the handle is when I'm filing on both sides, and I've also marked the rake angle that this guide is going to help me file. So in this case it's 14 degrees, and I've done that on both sides. I've also put it on the top. Now you'll see these 2 lines here. You don't need these if you're going to be filing a rip saw, because you won't be filing any fleam into it. But in this case, when I get to sharpening it, I will cut these 20-degree angles off from both sides, and you'll see how that helps me when I get to sharpening. So I'll show you, I'll talk more about that then. But you don't need that when you're filing a rip saw, and I leave them on to start with, so it gives me a longer reference surface when I'm shaping the teeth, because remember, shaping the teeth is always at 90 degrees to the saw plate. Okay, so now I come to drill the hole where I'm going to stuff the file in, and you remember that these are tapered saw files, so they get thinner towards the end. So what I do is I find about 1/2 inch from the end, and I get a drill that's the same diameter as halfway up the taper, and that's what I'll use to drill my hole. So I just stand the guide on its edge, and I want to stop with my drill just short of halfway through. Turn it over and do the other side as well. Then I take my protractor and I set it to the rake angle of 14 degrees in this case. And I scribe along a line tangential to the edge of the hole. And I use a marking knife to do that. just so that you can see it, I'll fill the line with pencil. I don't usually bother to do that, but just so that you can see it. Okay, so there's my line at the correct angle. So the handle is this way, and that's the angle of the front of the tooth. So then I take my file and I position it in the hole, and as I push it in I make sure that the flat of the file is parallel to that line. And you want to make sure that you're square there and also in that direction before you finish driving the file home. So now you can see that the front face of my file is parallel to my rake angle. Okay, so when I'm filing now, this face of the file is at the correct rake angle of 14 degrees. Now on the other side, I want the line going that way because my handle's this side. Okay, so after I've filed one side, I'll take the file out, put it in the other side at that angle. Okay, so I'll just do that one now. Change the angle on my protractor, 14 degrees in the other direction. Scribe my line. Line up my file, drive it in. Here we go. So that's a filing aid that will help you maintain your rake angle. It's comfortable to hold, feels nice in the hand, and when we get to sharpening we'll cut these off at 20-degree angle and it will help us file our fleam as well. Another aid that you can use for filing fleam again is a block of wood. This one's about 3 inches long. Some people like them a bit longer than that. But I've marked angles of 20 degrees, so you can see that on both sides, and I've cut down into the wood. And how this works is the block of wood sits on top of the saw plate at a 20-degree angle, and I can move it along the saw plate as I file down the teeth. And when I file from the other side, see the angle goes in the other direction, still at 20 degrees. Okay, so that helps me line up my fleam angle correctly. So these are the aids that we'll be using in this scenario, because when you're starting out you're probably not going to go to the expense of buying a Veritas file holder or the one from blackburntools.com that Isaac made. You'll start off with a block of wood and see if you like saw sharpening. Okay, so I'll clear this away and get the saw vise out. I'll joint the tops of the teeth off and then I'll bring you back in for the shaping stage. I've jointed the tops of the teeth off, and because I had fleam already on the teeth, what I've got is the tops of my teeth are pointing in that way, then that way, then that way, then that way. So if you can imagine what the top of the tooth looks like now, it's not straight across, it's like a triangle with the top lopped off one of the points, if you see what I mean. And then it goes that way, then it goes that way, then it goes that way. So what I've got to do in the shaping stage is bring the front of the teeth back to 90 degrees to the saw plate. So I'm watching my shiners, I've also got my eye on the tooth spacing. I've done the first few teeth, and every so often I'll duck my head down and I'll look along the gullets to make sure I'm keeping the gullets at the same height, and I'm using the same number of strokes on each tooth and the same amount of pressure, and the direction of my pressure now is straight down. Okay, I'm trying to keep a constant pressure straight down. It's only a light pressure because I'm trying to overcome that 17.5 degree fleam angle and the existing 10 degrees of rake angle. I'm changing that to 14 degrees. And because I'm changing my rake angle, the points of the teeth rather, are actually going to move slightly, aren't they, along the plate. That's inevitable, and that's fine, as long as you keep the distance that each tooth moves consistent. So you've got to watch your tooth spacing. You can do it by eye, it's not an issue. So I'll carry on, counting my strokes, and I'm using 3 strokes on each tooth, keeping my angles right, making sure my file is at 90 degrees to the plate. And you can see on my guide now that the H for my handle points towards the handle, rake angle 14 degrees, so my line is going that way, so the face of my file here is at 14 degrees. And it's just a case of keeping everything consistent, same amount of pressure, same direction of pressure, same number of strokes. Checking your shiners, make sure you don't go below the point line. Down, look at the gullets. And if I've got one gullet that's higher, what I do is I put my finger there and then I place the file in that gullet so I get the right tooth. Check it again. It's got it. So that's all there is to it really. Just move down the plate, doing exactly the same thing, keeping everything consistent. Pretty soon you will have changed the shape of the teeth to 14 degrees of rake, and then we can joint it again and do our sharpening and add the 20 degrees of fleam after we've set it, of course. So I'll carry on and do this, get to the end, and then I'll set the teeth, and then I'll bring you back in for the sharpening and show you how the fleam guides work. Okay, so I've finished shaping the teeth, and I've set the teeth, and I've just jointed off the tips of the teeth ready for sharpening. You'll also see that I've brought this to a point. I sawed off the 2 edges here to bring it to a point, so I've got 2 20-degree angles there, one for filing this side, so when this angle is parallel to my plate, I know that my file is at a 20-degree angle. And the other one is for when we start filing from the other side. So all I need to do is take the same number of passes, keeping my pressure straight down, ensuring that this edge of the wood is parallel to my plate, keeping my rake angle consistent. There's something very nice about using a block of wood. I mean, I like the Veritas file holder for its convenience and the fact that I don't have to make loads of these at different rake angles and different fleam angles, but there's something very nice about just holding a piece of wood. It's very tactile, very light, and you can really feel what's going on with the file. So much so that I can feel that this file's nearly on its way out. And you can probably hear that it's starting to squeak a bit, and that's one of the telltale signs. It also is squeaking though because I'm filing fleam into these teeth. Forget I'm filing the front of the tooth leaning away from me and the back of the tooth leaning towards me, and I'm putting the bevel on there with this fleam angle that is necessary for cross-cut teeth. Okay, so that's finished the first side. Now, when I come around the other side, it's necessary for me to turn the block of wood round so that the handle, arrow, is now pointing towards the handle, and I line my file up with the rake angle that's scribed into the piece of wood. Make sure it's square. Now I'm using this edge to file my fleam angle, and then when that's parallel to the saw plate, then my file is at 20 degrees. My rake angle here is at 14 degrees, so I've got to concentrate on keeping the wood horizontal and then file the alternate teeth that I didn't file on the first pass from the other side. When you saw me file this side, by the way, I'd already done a couple of passes, one stroke on each tooth, so I'll probably be doing the same again here, but so a total of 3 strokes per tooth, just light pressure, straight down, and that's really all this saw needs. So, in addition to the angles that I've got on my block of wood here on the end of my file, you can also use another block of wood with 2 curves cut in it at 20 degrees, one for one side, and just slide it along the plate. So when your file is parallel to that block of wood, then you know you're filing at 20 degrees. Okay, so that's another option that you've got for controlling your fleam angle and keeping it constant.
because that's there for the length of travel of the file, whereas you have the issue here where this angle, once it gets a bit further away from the saw plate, it's difficult to know whether you're actually 20 degrees or 22 degrees or 18 degrees. So that's another option. I personally don't like it because I just find it gets in the way basically, but it is an option. Some people use it. You just slide it along as you move down the plate. Another thing I don't like about it is that every time you slide it along, it fills the teeth up with sawdust, so you can't see them, so you're forever brushing it away. But it's an option. Try it, easily made. See if you like it. I've got a piece of hard maple here. Let's take this Spear & Jackson for a spin. Got a nice finish. I'm happy with that. I'm a simple man and I like to keep my saw sharpening simple. So I file all of my saws with a constant pitch to the teeth, constant rake angle and a constant fleam angle. As you're probably aware though, there are saws in existence today, and some of them have historical basis as well, that aren't filed like that. They aren't filed with a consistent pitch, rake and fleam. Some saws start with, say, a dovetail saw for example might have 20 points per inch for the first 2.5 inches, and the rest of the teeth might be filed at 16 points per inch. There are also progressive teeth on some dovetail saws where the pitch of the tooth gradually increases as you move towards the heel. There are also saws where the first few teeth might be sharpened with, say, a 5-degree rake angle on a dovetail saw, and then the next few teeth with a 3-degree rake angle, and then the rest of the teeth with a 0-degree rake angle. And these are all ways to make the saw start more easily. The only reason I mention this is because if you're going to sharpen your own saws, then they do add some more variables to the saw sharpening. Once you learn the basic process and the basic skills needed to sharpen your own saws, you'll be able to sharpen any of those saws as well. There's nothing complicated about it. You just have a few more things to think about, and you have to decide whether those saws are for you, or you just want to keep, as I do, a constant pitch, constant rake angle, constant fleam angle, and put in a few hours practice and learn to use the blooming saw. Did I just say that? Hush my mouth. I thought it'd be useful to show you a couple of diagrams of typical rake and fleam angles and the pitch of the teeth that are used with certain saws. So in this first diagram, this is looking at the rake angles, and you can see that for rip saws that are used for cutting softwoods, anything from 0 to 8 degrees. For hardwoods, anything from 6 to 12 degrees. Hybrid saws, that's saws that both cross-cut and rip, typically 10-degree rake angle. Cross-cut saws 12 to 16, and mitre saws usually 25 degrees. So the effect of rake: less rake would be used for softer woods. They will cut faster, it's more aggressive, but it's also harder to start. The more rake you add, you'll be looking at cutting harder woods. It will cut slower, but it will start easier. Fleam angles: for rip saws, typically 0 to 5 degrees, if anything. Okay, a lot of people like to add a touch of fleam to their rip teeth on their back saws. I personally don't, but don't let that stop you from adding 3 degrees of fleam if you want to. People say it gives them a smoother finish. Hybrid saws typically 10 to 17 degrees of fleam. Cross-cut saws used for cutting softwoods would typically be 20 to 25 degrees, hardwoods 15 to 20 degrees,
and mitre saws are generally filed at 30 degrees of fleam. The effects of fleam: less fleam for harder woods, it will stay sharp longer, it's a more robust cutting edge, but it will leave a rougher finish. More fleam for softer woods, but it will blunt quicker. It will leave a smoother finish though. So the choice is yours. And then for pitch, you can see I've detailed here various types of saws, their typical lengths and tooth profiles and the points per inch that they're typically filed at. I won't talk too much about this, but you can freeze frame any of these diagrams and read them at your leisure and study them and take it all in. Guys, if I've done my job properly, then I'm hoping by this point you're sitting there thinking, do you know what, I could do that, and you can. However, I do want to set your expectations, okay, because it looks very easy watching somebody else filing teeth, but what I can't teach you is the feel that you need to acquire for using a saw file. Now, it's very unlikely that the first 2 or 3 saws that you file will come out very good. Okay, and mine weren't any better. If you go and look at my Saw Talk blog on lumberjocks.com, search for Brit, I'll use the name there, look at my Saw Talk blog, you can see in the episodes there that details my journey into restoring these saws and learning to sharpen them. You'll see that I made some right mess ups of the teeth on my first saws, and even some after I've sharpened about 5 or 6 different saws, I was still messing them up occasionally. I filed cows and calves and some other issues. I got the point line not quite straight on some of my saws. This is to be expected, okay? Do not expect just to pick up one of these saw files and an old saw that you've bought at a flea market, and after you've restored it, don't expect to just be able to file the teeth to perfection. It is extremely unlikely you'll do that. But don't be discouraged, because what you're looking at now is the sum total of the saws that I have filed personally. 14 saws. And let me tell you, after about 8 or 9 saws, I was getting it. By the 10th saw, it no longer intimidated me. You know, I'm not saying saw filing is easy. You do need to concentrate. You need to think about what you're doing. You need to take your time, look at the effects that you're having on the teeth with every stroke of your file, and develop that feel for using the saw file. But you will get it. Trust me, you will get it. And you know, it's just like sharpening a chisel or a plane iron or an auger bit or anything else in woodworking. It takes time to acquire the skills and the feel to do it correctly. Now, I don't consider myself to be a saw sharpening expert, but I can tell you now that I will be filing my own saws for the rest of my life, as long as I'm able to do it, and as long as I'm able to carry on woodworking. It no longer intimidates me. And I sincerely hope that you're encouraged to have a go at it yourself and to persevere, to push through those initial setbacks, and when something goes wrong, analyse what happened, find out how to fix it, put it right and move on. Don't be discouraged. It's not that difficult, and once you get the feel for using this file, you've got it for life. It's like riding a bike, you never forget. Well guys, that's about all we've got time for in this video. I've tried to keep it real and include as much information as I could, whilst keeping the focus on what I consider people new to saw sharpening need to know. I really hope you've found it useful and are inspired to have a go at sharpening your own saws, so that together we can help keep the art of saw sharpening alive and pass it on to future generations.